Hello, my name is Brodie McLeod, and I am going to talk to you a little bit today about the COVID-19 pandemic. I think a lot of people found it very surreal, and there was a lot of kind of misinformation and disinformation regarding where it first originated from and why it happened. And I think that a lot of people, as much as we were all kind of blindly acquiescing to the government guidelines and vaccine procedural narratives and dealing with just such a insurmountable mass of fatalities, women, children, old people, spanning generations in every country in the world pretty much were fact that I want to talk about specifically just the cost to the UK and just kind of explore how tragic that situation was, and then hopefully debunk some people who think that it was some kind of fucking conspiracy theory to cover up like some sort of massive secret and institutionalized kind of martial law and all sorts of bumwash here on the internet. It would literally be the crime of the fucking century if it was just a man-made meerkats, comparing meerkats man-made genocidal atrocity. But it wasn't. It was just a really tragic, coincidental viral outbreak that affected a lot of people, and it's really fucking tragic what happened. So I've just crunched some numbers with a research paper. I haven't read this yet, so I can't guarantee it's going to be the best thing that I've ever researched, but what I've done is kind of offset, hopefully, how many lives we lost versus how many lives we could have saved with the same amount of money if we hadn't had to endure the pandemic, wherever that came from, and then hopefully debunk some of the conspiracy theories that it was all some kind of genocide, basically, because that's just fucking mental, isn't it? So the calculus of calamity, evaluating the tragic human and economic toll of COVID-19 against the persistent crisis of global hunger and thirst. Introduction. The dual spectres of human suffering. History is punctuated by cataclysms that fundamentally alter the trajectory of human civilization, reshaping economies, rewriting societal norms, and redefining the parameters of collective vulnerability. The arrival of SARS-CoV-2 virus at the end of 2019 precipitated a global health emergency of a magnitude unseen in a century. The ensuing COVID-19 pandemic exacted a harrowing human toll, shattering communities, overwhelming the most advanced healthcare systems on the planet, and resulting in the official deaths of approximately 7 million people globally. The response to this acute, highly visible crisis demanded an unprecedented mobilization of state resources, fundamentally rewriting the fiscal doctrines of advanced economies as governments injected trillions of dollars into their societies to prevent total economic collapse. Yet, as the global community rightfully directed vast fortunes, political will, and scientific ingenuity to combat a novel respiratory pathogen, a chronic older plague continued to silently claim millions of lives in the background. Global hunger, alongside a critical lack of access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation, represents a perpetual systemic crisis that fundamentally challenges the moral architecture of the modern world. Every single year, an estimated 9 million people succumb to starvation and malnutrition-related causes. Concurrently, a further 1.4 million individuals perish annually due to diseases directly attributable to inadequate water, sanitation, and hygiene infrastructure. These are not novel pathogens requiring complex, undiscovered vaccines. They are ancient, entirely curable afflictions of poverty and resource misallocation. This comprehensive research report takes a stark, data-heavy journalistic analysis of these intersecting tragedies, explicitly evaluating the human and financial cost of the pandemic against the systemic failure to eradicate starvation and dehydration. The analysis begins by meticulously chronicling the staggering financial cost of the COVID-19 pandemic to the United Kingdom, mapping the severe contraction of the British economy and the astronomical fiscal interventions deployed by the state to preserve it. It then juxtaposes this immense localised acute expenditure against the estimated budgets required by the United Nations World Food Programme and global health initiatives to permanently eradicate global hunger and thirst across the entire planet. By mathematically offsetting the financial cost of the pandemic against the price of ending systemic malnutrition and water scarcity, the analysis produces a macabre but necessary calculus. It calculates a total combined figure representing the official lives lost to the virus, added directly to the tens of millions of lives that could have been saved had the immense capital absorbed by the pandemic been deployed against a chronic crisis of starvation and thirst. Finally, in honouring the visceral tragedy of the lives lost to COVID-19, this report systemically dismantles the prominent dangerous conspiracy theories surrounding the pandemic, specifically the biologically and locally bankrupt assertions that the virus was a man-made engineered genocide. Through a respectful journalistic tone, this report paints a clear, unyielding picture of the lives lost, inextricably combined with the lives we possess the financial capacity to save. Fiscal avalanche, quantifying the unprecedented economic cost of COVID-19 to the United Kingdom. To truly comprehend the opportunity cost of the pandemic, one must first quantify the sheer scale of the economic intervention it required. The economic lockdown that followed the outbreak of COVID-19 in the United Kingdom resulted in a gross domestic product contraction of profound severity. In 2020, the British economy contracted by almost 10% compared to 2019, with official estimates placing the decline in real GDP between 9.7% and 11.0%, representing an economic shock of historic proportions. Records compiled by the Office for National Statistics suggest that this was the steepest year-on-year decline in British economic activity since the Great Frost of 1709, easily surpassing the catastrophic impacts of the 2008 global financial crisis, as well as the economic turmoil following the 1956 Suez crisis. It's sort of happening again now. The velocity of the collapse was unprecedented. Between February and April 2020 alone, as the first national lockdown took effect to protect public health and prevent National Health Service from being entirely overrun, the UK economy contracted by an astonishing 26%. Public health measures, including strict social distancing mandates, international and domestic travel restrictions, and the mandated closure of non-essential retail and hospitality venues, drove a 19.8% fall in GDP between April and June 2020. The households' spending fell up by over 20% over this period, representing the largest quarterly contraction on record. It's vital to understand the nuances of how this economic contraction was measured, as it explains why the United Kingdom appeared to suffer a sharper initial economic hit than many of its international peers. A significant factor in the severity of the recorded UK GDP drop relates to differences in the way national statistics institutes measure real GDP. So specifically regarding government output in healthcare and education, the Office for National Statistics relies on direct measures of output as the actual number of hospital operations performed and the number of pupils physically taught in classrooms. During the pandemic, the prioritisation of COVID-19 patterns was accompanied by massive cancellations of elective care, routine general practitioner consultations and outpatient services. Simultaneously, nationwide school closures drastically reduced the measured volume of educational output. Consequently, despite massive increases in emergency health spending, the recorded real health output fell in the UK. By contrast, many other nations use deflated costs or inputs such as raw employment figures as a proxy for output, meaning the recorded GDP did not suffer the same statistical penalty for cancelled operations or closed schools. Nevertheless, even accounting for the statistical anomalies, the United Kingdom suffered a monumental economic blow exacerbated by its high infection rates, prolonged strict lockdowns, and an economy heavily weighted towards high contact social consumption activities such as recreation restaurants and hotels. The response from the UK government and the Bank of England was an unparalleled mobilisation of capital designed to keep businesses afloat, maintain household incomes and prevent a total collapse of the labour market. Government borrowing hit a peacetime high in the 20 to 21 financial year, driven almost entirely by a surge in emergency government spending rather than a proportional collapse in tax revenues. The Office for Budget Responsibility recorded the combined impact of the virus and the fiscal policy response pushed the UK deficit to 394 billion, equivalent to 19% of the UK's gross domestic product. It's represented the highest level of deficit borrowing recorded since the conclusion of the Second World War in 1944 and 1945. The total lifetime fiscal cost of the UK government's COVID-19 support measures is staggering. Estimates from the National Audit Office and Her Majesty's Treasury highly scrutinised COVID-19 cost tracker indicate that measures will eventually cost the state approximately 373 billion. This equates to roughly 5,565 for every single man, woman and child residing in the country. Of this monumental figure, at least 358 billion has already been spent and accounted for. The International Monetary Fund provided an even higher estimate. Analysing the data to September 2021, the IMF calculated total UK spending at 407 billion. That's about £6,000 per person, when accounting for direct spending alongside the taxes and duties that governments explicitly chose not to collect to ease the burden of the businesses. Furthermore, the IMF estimated a total of 353 billion in off-budget measures, largely consisting of spending that could occur if businesses default on emergency government-backed loans. This capital was directed into monumental public support architectures that fundamentally altered the relationship between the state and the citizen. The most expensive schemes included Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, commonly known as the furlough scheme, which saw the government step in to pay the wages of millions of private sector employees. Other massive expenditures included the procurement of personal protective equipment at heavily inflated global market prices, the establishment of the NHS test and trace system, and the nationwide research, procurement and rollout of vaccines. Additional welfare responses, such as a temporary £20 per week uplift to universal credit, vastly exceeded the welfare responses implemented during the 2008 financial crisis. Her Majesty's Treasury estimates that direct support to businesses was the largest expenditure category at 140 billion through the Office for Budget Responsibility, though the Office of Budget Responsibility puts the total for this specific category lower at 64 billion, prioritising public services spending as the largest draw. The macroeconomic consequences of this expenditure will be felt for generations. This unprecedented peacetime rise in borrowing lifted public sector net debt well above 100% of GDP, its highest level since the early 1960s. It's embedded a structural economic burden that will require careful fiscal management, higher taxation and potential public service constraints over several decades. The British state, acting in the face of an existential, highly visible threat, proves beyond any doubt that when a crisis is perceived as immediate and universally threatening, the capacity to generate and deploy roughly 400 billion is entirely within the realm of possibility. The visceral tragedy, the human cost and the harrowing reality of COVID-19 fatalities. The expenditure of hundreds of billions of pounds was not an abstract exercise in macroeconomic theory. It was a desperate reactive defensive manoeuvre against a novel pathogen that inflicted profound physical, emotional and societal devastation. The human cost of COVID-19 is a visceral tragedy that defies simple quantification through the harrowing statistics, though the harrowing statistics paint a picture of global suffering and unparalleled in modern times. According to official counts painstakingly compiled and reported to the World Health Organization, approximately 7 million people died as a direct result of COVID-19 infections. The timeline of these fatalities traces a grim trajectory of the virus's relentless march across the globe. From the initial handful of deaths reported in January 2020, the numbers violently escalated, with weekly reported fatalities routinely surpassing 50,000 by the late 2020. year, and frequently breaching 80,000 to 100,000 weekly deaths during the devastating surges of the early 2021 and early 2022. Even as the acute phase of the pandemic waned, the virus continued to claim thousands of lives weekly throughout 23, 24, into 25, and even this year, 26, serving as a grim reminder of the pathogen's endemic permanence. However, this official tally of 7 million captures only a fraction of the true devastation. A comprehensive, rigorously modelled analysis of global excess mortality reveals a much darker, far more expansive reality. Excess mortality is defined as the difference between the total number of deaths that actually occurred and the number of deaths that would have been expected in the absence of the pandemic, based on historical non-crisis mortality rates. Between the 1st of January 2020 and December the 31st, 2021 alone, the World Health Organization estimates that global excess mortality associated with the pandemic was approximately 14.9 million deaths, with an estimated range extending up to 16.6 million. This figure of nearly 15 million encompasses the direct victims of the virus, but crucially it also captures the devastating collateral damage of the pandemic. Direct deaths were those individuals who succumbed to severe acute respiratory syndrome, often drowning in the fluid of their own inflamed lungs, suffering catastrophic multiple organ failure, and dying in isolated intensive care units separated from their families by strict infection control protocols. The indirect deaths represent an equally harrowing tragedy: individuals who perished from preventable cardiovascular events and undiagnosed oncological progressions, diabetic ketoacidosis, and routine systems traumas, physical traumas, simply because local health systems were completely overwhelmed by the surge of infectious patients, rendering emergency rooms inaccessible and life-saving surgeries impossible. The calculation of this massive death toll required highly complex statistical modelling overseen by a technical advisory group for COVID-19 mortality assessment convened by the World Health Organization and the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Because many countries lack the capacity for reliable mortality surveillance and do not generate the data necessary to calculate excess mortality directly, demographers and epidemiologists utilised Poisson regression models to generate comparable estimates. These models had to account for averted deaths, fatalities that did not occur because the pandemic altered human behaviour, such as a decrease in motor vehicle accidents or occupational injuries due to widespread lockdowns. So even after subtracting these averted deaths, the surplus mortality remained staggering. The pandemic exacted its toll without mercy, but it did not do so equally. The data indicates that the income level of a country directly affected the COVID-19 impact as well as the response. Middle-income countries accounted for a staggering 81% of the 14.9 million excess deaths, while high-income countries accounted for 15%. Approximately 84% of all excess deaths were concentrated in just three main regions: so Southeast Asia, Europe and the Americas. Roughly 68% of all global excess deaths were concentrated in just 10 countries and 20 nations, including Brazil, Colombia, Egypt, Germany, India, Indonesia, Iran, Italy, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, Peru, the Philippines, Poland, Russia, South Africa, Turkey, Ukraine and the United Kingdom. And the United States accounted for over 80% of the estimated global excess mortality. Demographically, the global death toll skewed higher for men than for women, representing 57% and 43% of fatalities respectively, and was significantly concentrated among older adults. Behind every single digit in these millions is a visceral narrative of human loss. It is the story of entire generations of elders erased from their communities, of children orphaned overnight, of healthcare workers breaking under the psychological and physical weight of ceaseless triage, and of an entire global population plunged into a collective state of mourning and isolation. The official fatalities and the millions of excess deaths represent a gaping void in the human fabric, a tragic erasure of lives that leaves an intergenerational scar on the consciousness of humanity. The silent pandemics, the persistent horror of global hunger and water insecurity. While the world's attention, scientific prowess and vast financial capital were singularly focused on mitigating the acute threat of SARS-CoV-2, a chronic systemic failure of global resource allocation continued to claim millions of lives unabated. Global hunger and the lack of access to clean water and sanitation represents tragedies of equal, if not greater, visceral horror than the COVID-19 pandemic, rendered invisible only by their persistence, their historical normalisation, and their geographical concentration in the global south. The scale of the current global hunger and malnutrition crisis is an absolute indictment of modern civilization. According to the United Nations World Food Programme, a staggering 828 million people, roughly 1 in 10 individuals on the planet, are hungry. Of those, approximately 318 million people face acute crisis levels of food insecurity, meaning their inability to access adequate nutrition poses an immediate threat to their lives and livelihoods. Most terrifyingly, 50 million people are currently teetering on the absolute brink of famine, representing the most catastrophic level of food shortage. The conflict in the Middle East, particularly the destruction in the Gaza Strip alongside the ongoing war in Sudan, has deepened this crisis to an alarming degree. In Gaza alone, the local Ministry of Health documented hundreds of deaths related directly to malnutrition, with over 320,000 children under the age of 5 at severe risk of acute malnutrition due to the deliberate restriction of humanitarian aid and the destruction of agricultural infrastructure. The fatal consequences of this systemic failure are devastating. Approximately 9 million people die every single year from hunger and malnutrition-related causes, despite the global economy possessing an estimated 400 trillion in wealth during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. While the virus dominated global headlines and commanded trillions in emergency funding, starvation was silently killing an estimated 24,000 people every single day. This equates to roughly 1,000 human beings dying from a lack of food every hour, an ongoing atrocity that occurs in a world of profound material abundance. The physical reality of severe acute malnutrition is agonising, particularly for the most vulnerable demographic, young children. An estimated 4.9 million children die before their 5th birthday every year. Over 100,000 of these young children die directly from severe acute malnutrition, while malnutrition acts as the underlying cause in nearly half of all under 5 mortalities by critically composing the paediatric immune system, making children highly susceptible to common childhood diseases like pneumonia and malaria. The physical effects of severe malnutrition are profoundly distressing to witness and represent a visceral bodily collapse. Children suffering from starvation exhibit prominent bones due to the rapid depletion of fat and muscle tissue, a condition known as wasting. Conversely, they may suffer from severe edema, a massive swelling of the belly, face and extremities due to dangerous fluid retention caused by severe protein deficiency, a condition historically known as kwashiorkor, hopefully I pronounced that right. The skin becomes pale, thick, inelastic and prone to severe rashes and lesions. The hair becomes thin, brittle, loses its natural pigment and pulls out easily from the scalp without resistance. As the starving body begins to consume its own organs for basal survival, the heart rates and blood pressure drop perilously, putting the child at extreme risk for life-threatening arrhythmias. They lose the ability to maintain basic body temperature, becoming perpetually cold. In severe cases, the child lacks the physical stamina to walk, stand, or even cry, sinking into a state of profound apathy, irritability, and eventual listlessness as their cognitive and physical development is permanently stunted. Running parallel to the agonising crisis of starvation is the equally lethal crisis of thirst and the lack of sanitation. Despite decades of global development initiatives, the world is failing to meet Sustainable Development Goal 6. Currently, 2.1 billion people still lack access to safely managed drinking water, including 106 million who are forced to drink directly from untreated surface sources like rivers and lakes. Furthermore, 3.4 billion people lack access to safely managed sanitation, with over 350 million people forced to practice open defecation. The consumption of microbiologically contaminated water transmits a host of lethal diseases, including cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and polio. The World Health Organization estimates that 1.4 million people die preventable deaths every year directly attributable to unsafe water, sanitation and hygiene. Over 500,000 of these annual fatalities are diarrheal deaths, a condition that rapidly and brutally dehydrates the body, stripping it of vital electrolytes and fluids and disproportionately killing young children. Beyond mortality, poor sanitation exacerbates stunting, contributes heavily to the spread of antimicrobial resistance and severely reduces human well-being through the persistent threat of neglected tropical diseases like intestinal worms, schizomatosis, whatever that says, and trachoma. Crucially, these staggering statistics of death and suffering are not inevitable forces of nature. They are the direct result of a lack of sustained political will and severe resource misallocation. The financial solutions are well documented and remarkably attainable to end world hunger by 2030, achieving the mandate of Sustainable Development Goal 2. The United Nations World Food Programme estimates it would cost approximately $40 billion per year to merely stave off the immediate famine for the 50 million people most at risk of starving to death right now. The WFP requires a fraction of that amount, roughly 7 billion. A life-saving nutrition-packed meal can be provided by the WFP for as little as 43 pence, or cents as it got there. Similarly, the solutions to the global water crisis are highly cost-effective. Achieving universal access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation across the globe is estimated at approximately 114 billion annually, that's in dollars. To eliminate specific practice of open defecation, the first-time capital costs are merely 1.5 billion annually, alongside the maintenance costs of 3.9 billion. Research indicates that these are not merely humanitarian expenditures, but profound economic investments. Every single dollar invested in water access and sanitation yields an average of $6.80 in economic returns to society through improved health, productivity and reduced healthcare burdens. When juxtaposed against the vast wealth of the global economy, the financial requirements to end the physical agony of starvation and fatal dehydration are agonisingly small. The failure to deploy these funds represents an ongoing silent calamity. The macabre calculus offsetting the financial cost of calamity. To truly comprehend the scale of the capital deployed by advanced economies during COVID-19 pandemic, one must engage in a macabre but profoundly necessary calculus by evaluating the United Kingdom's singular pandemic expenditure against budgets required to eradicate global hunger and thirst. This mathematical exercise forcefully highlights the staggering opportunity cost of humanity's chronic failure to address systemic global inequality. It quantifies exactly what could have been achieved if the political will mobilised against a novel virus had been directed towards the oldest enemies of human survival. Taking the highly scrutinised estimates from Her Majesty's Treasury and the International Monetary Fund, the United Kingdom government spent approximately £390 billion to combat the economic and public health fallout of COVID-19. This figure represents a median point between NATO's 373 billion estimate and IMF's 407 billion calculation, representing the direct capital deployed or foregone by a single nation to preserve its society during the acute crisis. According to the executive leadership of the World Food Programme, the comprehensive cost to entirely eradicate global hunger and achieve food security for all is about 40 billion per year. Converted to British pounds, $40 billion that is, utilising an appropriate historical exchange rate applicable to the era, that equates to roughly 32 billion pounds per year. If the United Kingdom's pandemic expenditure of 390 billion had instead been allocated directly to World Food Programme's mandate, the UK alone could have fully funded the global eradication of hunger for slightly over 12 years. That's 390 billion divided by 32 billion per year, equating to 12.18 years. Bit of a waste of money, wasn't it, the COVID virus? I mean, not a waste of money, it was important that we spent that money, but it'd be great if we spent it on something else, you know. But it wasn't a conspiracy, so that's the main thing to keep in mind. You know, it wasn't like covering up for some sort of like deep state paedophile ring or like Trident or Nazis or any of the other bullshit you read about on the internet. You know, the banks all being involved in murder or sex trafficking or, yeah, God knows, there's all sorts of shit on the internet. We'll go into that in a bit. The human implications of this direct financial equivalence are staggering to contemplate, as established severe hunger and malnutrition claim approximately 9 million lives every single year. If the capital absorbed by the UK during the pandemic had been deployed to successfully eradicate hunger over a continuous 12.18 year period, it represents the potential preservation of nearly 110 million human lives. So 12.8 years multiplied by 9 million deaths annually equates to 109,620,000 lives saved. So they could have saved 109 million people's lives with the money just that UK spent on COVID. Furthermore, we must factor in the global crisis of unsafe water and sanitation, which claims an additional 1.4 million lives annually. The estimated global cost to achieve universal access to safe water and sanitation is $140 billion a year, or approximately 91 billion quid. A combined annual global budget to entirely eradicate both global hunger and fatal thirst would therefore be roughly £123 billion, or £32 billion for food eradication, plus £91 billion for water and sanitation infrastructure. Even measured against the massive combined total, the UK's singular COVID-19 expenditure of 390 billion quid could have fully funded the total eradication of global hunger, thirst and unsafe sanitation for over 3 entire years for the entire planet. Over a 3-year period, this dual eradication strategy would save 27 million lives from starvation and 4.2 million from waterborne diseases, representing over 31 million human beings spared from agonising, entirely preventable deaths. However, adhering strictly to the prompt's requirement to offset the pandemic cost against the World Food Programme's £32 billion annual hunger eradication budget over the next 12-year window, we must produce a total combined figure. The figure fuses the tragic fatalities caused by COVID-19 with the exact number of lives that could have been saved from hunger using the equivalent pandemic funds over that specific span. So the calculation is as followed. The official global fatalities directly caused by COVID-19 pandemic stand at approximately 7 million human beings. Potential lives that could have been saved from starvation over 12.18 years, utilising the UK's pandemic fiscal expenditure, stands at 109,620,000 human beings. So the total combined human cost, representing lives lost to the virus, added to the lives lost during the diversion of equivalent financial resources away from hunger eradication, totals 116,620,000 lives. This figure, approaching 170 million human beings, paints a visceral, devastating and mathematically stark picture of systemic tragedy. It empathically expresses not only the acute horror of the 7 million souls lost to a novel virus choking in hospital beds away from their loved ones, but also the chronic silent horror of over 100 million lives that slip away into the dark due to humanity's collective failure to allocate a fraction of its immense wealth to end starvation. It demonstrates beyond any reasonable doubt that the financial resources to save tens of millions of emaciated children absolutely exist. They simply require the political will and dismantling of geopolitical apathy and the perception of an immediate shared existential threat to be mobilised. Dismantling the disinformation pandemic, debunking the engineered genocide conspiracy, because this is bullshit, yeah? Nobody just engineered this as a cover-up for, like, you know, the British police force or, like, paedophile rings or, like, of so much shit on the internet. You just wouldn't believe, you couldn't make it up, man. Like, so, yeah, disinformation and the pandemic, debunking the engineered genocide conspiracy, the profound psychological trauma, economic disruption and societal isolation inflicted by the COVID-19 pandemic created incredibly fertile ground for fear, uncertainty and the rapid proliferation of disinformation. Just desperate populations struggling to comprehend a faceless microscopic threat frequently turned to desperate ideologies. Among the most persuasive, insidious and deeply disrespectful narratives that emerged was the conspiracy theory that SARS-CoV-2 was not a natural biological occurrence, but rather a man-made biological weapon explicitly engineered and intentionally released to enact global genocide. In honouring the memory of the millions who died and in preserving the integrity of global public health infrastructure, it's an absolute necessity for serious journalism and the scientific community to unequivocally debunk these claims. The scientific consensus regarding the origins of the SARS-CoV-2 points firmly and overwhelmingly toward a natural zoonotic spillover. Extensive genomic analysis and evolutionary biological studies demonstrate that the virus was transmitted to humans through a complex process of accumulated mutations while circulating among animal populations. So concrete evidence shows that the adaptation processes through recombination events among various wild hosts like bats and pangolins, mirroring the natural emergence of pathways of previous deadly pathogens like SARS-CoV-1 in 2003 and MERS-CoV in 2012. The available epidemiological evidence strongly indicates that infected wild animals serving as intermediate hosts at the Hanwan seafood market in Wuhan, China, acted as the primary vector for the transmission to the human population in December 2019. The alternate hypothesis that the virus was deliberately engineered by a government or military entity as a biological weapon lacks all scientific, historical and logical credibility. So I just had to pause the recording there as I had some staff entering my room and make sure I can't record the stuff. So I'm going to start from the top of this paragraph. The alternate hypothesis that the virus was deliberately engineered by a government or military entity as a biological weapon lacks all scientific, historical and logical credibility. Virologists and microbiologists note that the SARS-CoV-2 is sufficiently unlike any previously known virus to have been successfully created from them. Manufacturing a complex virus of this specific nature from scratch in a laboratory would be virtually impossible given current technological constraints. Furthermore, researchers have pointed out that the furin cleavage site, a specific feature of the virus frequently cited by conspiracy theorists as definitive evidence of human tampering, is naturally occurring. Crucially, historical experimental attempts by scientists to artificially generate a furin cleavage site in bat coronaviruses have failed, strongly supporting the conclusion that its presence in SARS-CoV-2 is the result of natural evolution, not laboratory manipulation. Furthermore, there is absolutely no scientific publication, leaked document or credible whistleblower testimony indicating that a pre-existing virus matching the SARS-CoV-2 genetic backbone existed in any laboratory prior to the pandemic. While the lab leak theory suggesting an accidental exposure during research remains a subject of investigation due to the proximity of the outbreak to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the scientific claim of international bioengineering and genocidal release is entirely unfounded. Dr. Shi Zheng Li, the director of the Center for Emerging Infectious Diseases at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, consistently clarified that her lab had not conducted any unpublished gain-of-function experiments on the coronaviruses that could have resulted in SARS-CoV-2. While her team did conduct research on SARS-related viruses, the viruses used in these experiments were not complete. Infectious viral particles capable of replication. They consisted of synthesized genetic sequences and pseudoviruses lacking the ability to replicate and cause a pandemic. From the geopolitical and strategic standpoint, the bioweapon theory collapses under the weight of rudimentary logical scrutiny. The fundamental foundational principle of biological warfare dictates that a state actor developing and releasing a deadly pathogen must simultaneously possess a pre-developed vaccine or antidote to protect its own population, the military forces and economic infrastructure. The undeniable reality that China suffered massive societal disruption, profound economic losses and a severe domestic health toll demonstrates the sheer implausibility of the virus being a controlled, engineered weapon unleashed by the Chinese state or the UK state, the NHS or, the deep state. Furthermore, an exhaustive review by the United States intelligence community after examining all available classified reporting reached a broad agreement and explicitly judged that the virus was not developed as a biological weapon, asserting with high confidence that Chinese officials did not have any foreknowledge of the virus before the initial outbreak emerged in Wuhan or like anywhere in Europe, or even in the UK, at the Centre for Disease Control. Or even more disturbing than the bioweapon theory is the virulent anti-vaccine conspiracy that claims the pandemic itself is not real and that the subsequent global vaccination effort is the true genocidal plot aimed at population control and other shit like that. Proponents of this theory have grossly and offensively misappropriated historical models of the atrocity, including the renowned 10 stages of genocide framework, to frame public health measures as acts of extermination. Dr. Gregory Stanton, the founding president of Genocide Watch and the creator of the 10 stages of genocide model, has fiercely and publicly condemned this disinformation. Genocide Watch officially classifies the anti-vaccine conspiracy theories as entirely imaginary, false and unscientific. Dr. Stanton emphasises that for a genocide to occur, there must be real, demonstrable conspiracy to commit acts of physical extermination against a specific national, ethnic, racial or religious group. Vaccines are universal, rigorously tested public health tools that favour no ethnicity and target no specific demographic. Their sole biological epidemiological purpose is the preservation of human life, not its destruction. Genocide Watch declared that the misuse of genocidal models to support unscientific anti-vaccine ideology is morally reprehensible. Such conspiracies inflict profound societal damage. By discouraging vulnerable populations from receiving life-changing inoculations, these individuals actively prevent the achievement of the hard immunity necessary to totally defeat the pathogen, resulting in thousands of unnecessary deaths. Furthermore, labelling public health initiatives as genocide deeply insults the memory of the millions of victims of actual historical genocides, from the Holocaust to Rwanda, who suffered under real, meticulously documented campaigns of extermination. The graveyards filled with the millions of victims of COVID-19 are not imaginary, and the suffering of those who choked to death on ventilators was not a hoax. The virus was a devastating force of nature amplified by modern globalization and environmental encroachment, not a Kabbalistic plot. Distinguishing these stark scientific realities from paranoid fallacies is essential to maintaining public trust, honouring the dead, and adequately preparing global infrastructure for future epidemiological threats. Synthesis and conclusion: a paradigm shift in human priorities. So the COVID-19 pandemic was an era-defining tragedy that tested the absolute limits of human endurance, scientific ingenuity and state intervention. The United Kingdom's expenditure of roughly $400 billion to mitigate the virus's impact, mirroring similar multi-trillion-dollar expenditures by advanced economies worldwide, stands as a profound testament to what a society can achieve when it treats a threat as an absolute, immediate, existential emergency. Governments proved that the rigid boundaries of fiscal conservatism can be instantly dissolved to save lives, protect incomes and fund unprecedented scientific endeavours. Yet when this staggering mobilisation of wealth is placed alongside the World Food Programme's $40 billion annual requirement to end global hunger, or the $114 billion required to end the fatal reality of global water insecurity, the reflection in the mirror of human priorities is deeply uncomfortable and morally compromising. The 7 million lives lost to SARS-CoV-2 virus represent an agonising, undeniable tragedy that warranted every ounce of scientific effort and economic sacrifice to prevent. However, the calculation produced in this report that over 160 million human lives are intertwined in this macabre equation, representing the victims of the virus alongside the tens of millions of starving individuals who could have been saved by an equivalent application of capital, exposes a profound systemic dissonance in global morality. We can collectively accept the deaths of 9 million people from hunger and the 1.4 million people from unsafe water every single year, year after year, not because we lack the logical capacity, the agricultural output or the financial resources to stop it. We accept it because we have historically normalised it, because the victims are overwhelmingly concentrated in the global south, and because starvation does not threaten to shutter the stock markets or overwhelm the intensive care units of London, New York or Paris. The pandemic proved conclusively that the excuse of financial impossibility regarding the eradication of global poverty is a myth. The capital exists, the logistical networks exist, the scientific understanding of nutrition and sanitation exists. So the capital, sorry, I had another interruption from staff there. They really don't want me to put this video out. The capital exists, the logistical networks exist, the scientific understanding of networks of nutrition and sanitation exists. What is absent is the political will to view the death of a child from malnutrition in Sudan or Gaza with the same urgent system-stopping pandemic as the death of a citizen from a novel virus in a developed nation. The global community looks to a future beyond the immediate acute shadow of SARS-CoV-2. The ultimate lesson of the pandemic should not merely be about virology, mRNA technology, or supply chain resilience. It must trigger a fundamental paradigm shift in how humanity values life and allocates its immense resources. The harrowing statistics of wasting children, fatal diarrhea diseases, and the systemic starvation must be treated with the exact same urgency, panic, and massive fiscal mobilisation as the pandemic. The trillions spent on COVID-19 demonstrate our vast capacity to protect human life when we choose to do so. Until the chronic, silent crisis of hunger and thirst are approached with the acute urgency of a sudden plague, the global community will remain complicit in a perpetual, entirely preventable tragedy of millions trapped in a calculus of calamity that we have the ultimate power to rewrite.